I want you to imagine something. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, your heart monitor going silent and then nothing. And in that moment, the only thing running through your mind is not the money you made or the titles you earned or the things you bought. It is the faces, just the faces of the people you loved and the people you failed and the ones you never told the truth to. My name is Dorothy Robert, and I am 95 years old, and I have been that close to that moment twice in my life, and what I learned from it is something nobody is going to teach you in school or church or anywhere else you have ever been. I was born in 1930 in a small town in rural Tennessee where nobody locked their doors, and everybody knew everybody else's business, whether they wanted to or not. My mother had 7 children, and she raised all 7 of us in a house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom and a kitchen that smelled like cornbread every single morning of my childhood. We were not poor in the way people talk about poor today. We had food and we had each other and we had enough. But we did not have much beyond that, and my mother made sure we understood the difference between enough and wanting more than you needed. My father worked at a textile mill 6 days a week and came home smelling like machine oil and sawdust, and he would sit at the kitchen table after dinner and just look out the window for a while before he spoke to any of us. I used to think he was tired. I was older before I understood that he was carrying things he did not know how to put down. Men of that generation did not talk about what was heavy inside them. They just carried it until it crushed them or until they died, whichever came first. My father carried his until it crushed him. He had his first heart attack at 58 and his second one at 61, and he was gone before I was old enough to ask him the questions I needed to ask. That is one of the things I want to tell you about today, the questions you are not asking the people in your life right now, because you think there is time. You always think there is time. And then one morning you wake up and the person you needed to ask is not there anymore, and you are left standing in the middle of your own life holding a whole collection of questions that will never get answered. I have been standing in that place more times than I can count, and I am telling you from 95 years of living that the weight of an unasked question is heavier than almost anything else I have ever carried. I married my husband Thomas when I was 22 years old. He was tall and quiet, and he had a way of listening to you that made you feel like you were the only person in the entire world. I had never met a man who listened like that before. Most of the men I had known before Thomas talked over you or talked at you or talked around you, but Thomas listened. He looked right at you and he listened, and I thought that was enough. I thought a man who listens is a man who loves you, and I was young enough and naive enough to believe that those two things were the same. We had 4 children together, 3 daughters and a son. Thomas worked as a high school history teacher for 31 years in the same building in the same town, and people in that community respected him deeply. Parents would stop me at the grocery store and tell me what he had meant to their children. Students came back years later, grown adults with children of their own, just to tell him that his class had changed something in them. And I was proud of him. I was genuinely proud of him. But there is a particular loneliness that comes from being married to someone that everyone else sees as remarkable, because you start to wonder if the person they are seeing is the same person who sits across from you at breakfast every morning and says almost nothing. Thomas was not a cruel man. I want to be very clear about that. He never raised his voice at me or at the children. He never did anything that you would point to and say that is wrong, but he was somewhere else for most of our marriage. He was present in the room and absent from the life, and I spent the better part of 20 years trying to figure out how to reach him, trying different things, different approaches, different versions of conversations I had rehearsed in my head for days before I ever said them out loud. And Thomas would listen, the way he always listened, and then he would nod slowly and say something thoughtful and measured, and nothing would change. I am not telling you this to speak badly of a man who has been gone for 15 years now. I am telling you this because I think a lot of people are living inside that same particular loneliness right now, and they do not have a name for it. They are with someone, technically. They share a home and a bed and a last name and a history, but they are profoundly, quietly, persistently alone inside that relationship. And they keep waiting for it to change because leaving feels like too enormous a thing to do, and staying feels like the only thing they know. I stayed. I stayed for all 37 years of that marriage, and I do not know even now at 95 whether staying was the right thing or the wrong thing. I know it is what I did. I know it is what my children needed me to do when they were small. And I know that by the time they were grown enough that I might have left, I had been in that life so long that I did not know what I would be outside of it. That is a thing that happens to people, especially to women of my generation, but I do not think it is only a thing of my generation. You build a life around someone, and the life becomes your identity, and then the thought of dismantling it becomes the same as the thought of dismantling yourself. So you stay, and you learn to find small things to be grateful for, and some days that is enough, and some days it is nowhere near enough. And you just get through those days and you do not talk about them. Thomas died in 2009. A stroke, sudden, no warning. He was sitting in his chair in the living room reading a book about the Civil War, which was the kind of thing he read, and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. And I sat in that hospital waiting room while they told me what I already knew. And the thing I felt most, the thing I'm ashamed to tell you, but I am going to tell you anyway, because that is why I am here. The thing I felt most was not grief. It was something quieter and more complicated than grief. It was a kind of exhausted relief mixed with a sadness so deep I did not have a bottom to it, and I did not know what to do with those two things existing at the same time inside me. I did not talk about it for years. I could not find the words for it, and even if I had found the words, I would not have known who to say them to. I am telling you now because I think some of you are carrying something exactly like that and you have nowhere to put it. And I want you to know that carrying two contradictory things inside you at the same time does not make you a bad person. It makes you human. Grief is almost never clean. It is almost never just sadness. It is tangled up with every complicated thing that came before it. And the people who tell you how to grieve have usually never sat with grief that was this mixed up and this honest. After Thomas died, I did something I had never done in my entire adult life. I lived alone. For the first time since I was 22 years old, I was in a house by myself, responsible for nothing but myself, answerable to nobody but myself, and I thought I would hate it. I had spent so many decades being needed and being present and being available that I assumed solitude would feel like punishment, but it did not. It felt like breathing. It felt like taking off something heavy that I had worn so long I had stopped noticing the weight of it. I would wake up in the morning and make exactly the kind of coffee I wanted in exactly the amount I wanted, and I would sit at my kitchen table in the quiet and just exist. And it was the first time in decades that I understood what it felt like to simply be with yourself. I want to say something about that, about being with yourself, because I think it is something that most people run from their entire lives without ever realizing they are running. We fill every silence. We reach for the television or the phone or the noise of other people because the silence feels threatening somehow. Like if it gets quiet enough, you might actually have to hear your own thoughts, and your own thoughts might tell you things you are not ready to hear. I spent 40 years afraid of my own quiet, and when I finally stopped running from it, when I finally just sat inside it and let it be what it was, I found out that what was in the quiet was not as frightening as what I had been imagining. It was just me, just the plain, imperfect, ordinary truth of who I actually was, separate from all the roles I had spent a lifetime playing. My oldest daughter, Margaret, called me about 6 months after Thomas passed, and she said, "Mom, I am worried about you. You seem different." And I told her I was different. I told her I was figuring out who I was for the first time in my life at the age of 79, which is either a tragedy or a miracle, depending on how you decide to look at it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That actually sounds wonderful." And I think she meant it. I think she was relieved that I was not falling apart the way she had expected. Children spend so much of their adulthood bracing for their parents to fall apart, and sometimes the most generous thing you can do for them is refuse to. I want to talk to you about my granddaughter because she is a large part of why I am sitting here telling you any of this. Her name is Claire, and she is 34 years old, and she is one of the most capable, intelligent, driven people I have ever known in my life. She reminds me of myself in some ways, which is either a compliment or a warning. I have not decided which yet. Claire came to visit me about 2 years ago, and she sat with me for an entire afternoon on my back porch, and she told me about her life, about her job and her apartment and the relationship she was in that was not making her happy, but that she was staying in because leaving felt too hard. And as she talked, I kept hearing myself. Not the words she was using, but the feeling underneath the words. The feeling of someone who is managing their life rather than living it. Someone who has learned to be very good at getting through things. I did not give her advice that afternoon. I want to be clear about that because I do not believe that advice is what most people actually need when they come to talk to you. What they need is to be heard by someone who is not going to panic at what they say and who is not going to immediately try to fix it. I just sat with her and I listened the way Thomas used to listen to other people's children all those years, and I watched something unknot in her as she talked. By the end of the afternoon, she was crying, not the kind of crying that comes from being sad, but the kind that comes from finally letting something out that has been held in too long. And she told me that she had not said any of that out loud to anyone before. That broke my heart a little, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way, because I know what it costs a person to carry something unspoken for too long. I know because I did it for decades, and I wish someone had sat with me at 34 the way I sat with Claire. I wish someone older than me had looked me in the face and said, "You do not have to perform your life for other people. You are allowed to have a real one." So I am saying it now. You do not have to perform your life for other people. Whatever you are carrying around that you have not said out loud yet, whatever the thing is that you keep almost saying and then pulling back, I want you to know that you can say it. Not to me necessarily. I am 95 and I do not have a great deal of time left to collect other people's secrets, but to someone who has known you long enough to know the difference between the performed version of you and the real one. Those people exist in your life. You may have been avoiding them because they see you too clearly, and that is uncomfortable. Go back to those people. I think about time differently than I used to. When you are young, time is something you have so much of that you almost stop noticing it, the way you stop noticing the air you breathe. And then one morning you are 95 and you really understand in your body and not just in your head that the amount you have left is genuinely, measurably small. And that understanding does something interesting to you. It does not make everything feel urgent and panicked the way you might think it would. What it actually does is make everything feel very precise. You stop tolerating things you do not have time to tolerate. You stop saying yes to things that cost you more than they give you back. You stop pretending to be comfortable with things that make you uncomfortable. You become, at the end of your life, the most honest version of yourself you have ever been. And the tragedy is that most people get there too late to do anything useful with that honesty. I am trying to give you that honesty now while you still have time to use it. I do not know how many years you have in front of you. None of us do. But I know that you probably have more than I have, and I know that what you do with them matters enormously, not in a grand, historical, legacy-building way, in a quiet, daily, who did I show up for today way. That is the only kind of mattering that has ever made any real difference to anyone. Here is what I know from 95 years of being alive on this earth. The relationships you invest in are the only investment that pays you back in something you can actually use. Not money, not recognition, not the feeling of having been right, the actual warmth of being known by someone and knowing them back. That is it. That is the whole thing. I have sat in rooms with people who had enormous amounts of money and very little of that warmth, and I have sat in rooms with people who had almost nothing and were so full of it that they could not contain it, and there has never been any confusion in my mind about which room I would rather be in. My mother, who raised 7 children in a 2-bedroom house in rural Tennessee, died at 84, and she died surrounded by every single one of those children and by grandchildren she had known by name and by heart. And her last day was not a quiet day of suffering alone. It was a loud day. It was a full day. There were people in that room who had driven through the night to be there, who had rearranged their entire lives to be there, not out of obligation, but out of love. The real kind, the kind that accumulates over a lifetime of small, consistent, ordinary acts of showing up. And when she died, she was held, and that is the only ending I have ever seen that I would genuinely call a good one. I hope that for you. I hope that when you get to the end of your time, whenever that is, you are held. And the only way I know to get there is to start now, not tomorrow, not when things calm down, not when you have more time or more money or more energy. Now, with the people you already have, in the ordinary Tuesday of your life. Because that is where all of it actually happens, not in the grand moments you plan for, in the regular, unremarkable minutes that you are spending right now, that are adding up quietly and without ceremony into your one life. My name is Dorothy Robert. I am 95 years old. I have outlived my husband and 2 of my dearest friends, and a version of myself I used to think I could not live without. And I am here in this chair, in this quiet, still finding things worth saying. I hope you find that too. I hope when you are 95 you have things worth saying and people worth saying them to. That is my wish for you. That is the whole of it. 2.